You're about to enter into a new world of knowledge, curiosities, and high strangeness. This is a podcast of Straight Up Strange Productions.
You're listening to Mysteries and Monsters. I'm your host, Paul Bestall. It's a warm welcome back to the one and only Dr. Jeff Meldrum on this episode of Mysteries and Monsters. The Doctor shares some of his experiences and adventures in regards to expeditions to China, looking into the Yeren and the belief that permeates the country, the misunderstanding of some Native American belief systems, and also the Himalayas Yeti. A massive thank you again, as always, to Dr. Meldrum for joining me. But before we hear from him, don't forget you can support Mysteries and Monsters by signing up at patreon.com/mystriesandmonsters. $4 a month gets you ad-free episodes, guaranteed early releases, bonus content, and more. And you can also click the link in the show notes as usual. A big thank you to my latest patron, Tony, and thank you to each and every one of you who continue to support the show. Mysteries and Monsters is across most social media websites. Please subscribe to the Mysteries and Monsters channel on YouTube. You can also visit mysteriesandmonsters.com for news and episodes. Our exclusive merchandise store is available through TeePublic, and you'll find the link to that in the show notes as well. And thank you to the people who have recently bought a t-shirt. I hope you enjoy your purchase. Our intro and outro music are performed by the marvellous Weary Pines. Thank you as always to Dean Bestall for his wonderful artwork, and the show is produced by Brennan Storr of the Ghost Story Guys. Now, time for more food for thought with the marvellous Dr. Meldrum. It's a long overdue return to the world of cryptozoology, as I am delighted to welcome back Dr. Jeff Meldrum to the show. As we eagerly await the second volume of Dr. Meldrum's work in regards to a sequel to his brilliant book Legend Meets Science, another year of busy speaking engagements and lectures upon the horizon, 2025 is once again another jam-packed year for our good friend, the Doctor. Dr. Meldrum, welcome back to Mysteries and Monsters.
Well, thanks so much for having me back. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks for wanting to come back. That always helps.
Yeah, definitely.
I had so many lovely comments when we spoke last time, Dr. Meldrum. I'm not sure whether people were quite surprised that I was able to try and keep up with you, or that we touched on some topics that, you know, as we were having that conversation, you were digging into your past memories and some cases that perhaps you hadn't spoken to for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And I think when you've got the body of experience that you've had, it's often one of those situations that you can go so many years without really sort of looking back on certain incidents or cases or people that you were involved in, which is some of the highlights of when we were speaking last time.
Right. Most definitely. In fact, you know, I was just putting the finishing touches on a presentation. I try to change things up so that when I have encore appearances, people will have something new and fresh to think about. And so this year I'm kind of, well, the catch line is science playing catch up. Mm-hmm. And it is referring to the fact that scientific revelations are starting to actually align with the notion of the existence of relic hominoids. And so I cast the net more broadly too. I mean, not only establishing a scientific context, but to differentiate and identify possible surviving lineages on this now recognized very bushy family tree. And, the simple question I often get is, well, what about the Yeti? What about the abominable snowman? Is that the same as, is that Asia's Bigfoot? And, in a generic sense, perhaps, but, just categorically. But as far as specificity, no. They're very different entities with different characteristics described, different perceptions by witnesses, a different footprint evidence, which is for me the litmus test. But it was, my point was of bringing this up in creating this new presentation. I'm kind of going down through a litany of some of those different relic hominoids, and it was really interesting. It was really fun to dig back because I always try to give my point of view. I mean, if I'm speaking on something, I don't want to just be a conduit who sits up there and cites other people's work. But I've had the good fortune of having firsthand experience and involvement with many of these subjects, many of these phenomenon, and engaged much of the evidence. And so I can relate to it and convey it to the audience from a first-person point of view, and oftentimes provide behind-the-scenes insights that are not afforded from other third-person perspectives. So a lot of the stuff that gets published, even by good researchers, I mean, they don't have that firsthand experience. They have to rely on published sources or interviews of contemporaneous people. But I can offer insights and qualifiers and caveats and question marks and exclamation points that with a different type of authority, I guess you'd say. Mm-hmm. And so it was fun to sit and weave together some of these stories. And it caused me, as you said, to kind of have that reflective moment looking back on the many, many different opportunities and experiences I've been afforded over the past, 20, 30 years now. And it's really quite amazing, the various corners of the globe and the people and many of these, very well-known figures in the history of the phenomenon I've rubbed shoulders with and taken meals together with and debated evidence with firsthand. So I'm looking forward to it. It's always fun to share those, digging back through the picture files and bringing back memories. And it's just always hard to pare it down to a 60 to 90 minute talk.
I suppose some people would be quite surprised with that, because I suppose it all depends on your level of interest in relic hominids, Dr. Meldrum, in regards to, some people think that they're all the same. They're just international variations, as you mentioned there, the abominable snowman, the Yeti, or the Yowie, or even as we discussed last time, things like the Oren Pendek and the Almast and the Yeren. Mm-hmm. But when you look into the cases and you look at the witnesses and you start to look at it beyond the fact that these are similar in stature creatures, there are some real sort of variations, as you mentioned, about behaviour. But I think some people would be really surprised that there would be differences in things like locomotion or the footprint or the way that they socialise or those kinds of interactions. Right. Because I think sometimes you can look at this too simplistically and think that the Yowie is simply Bigfoot's Australian cousin who got down there somehow, and therefore they're just basically cousins, when really, when we start to delve into this, they're similar, but they're probably not the same. And so for someone like yourself, you would be often considered the foremost person to speak to in regards to track prints and Sasquatch Bigfoot research in North America. Right. Do you often get involved, like you touched on there, in international cases such as Yerens, Yetis, Yowies?
Oh, most definitely. Most definitely. I mean, not to the degree and to the depth. Just don't have enough hours in the day or dollars in my bank account to finance the travel and so forth. But I have had some very singular opportunities to go and examine some of that evidence firsthand. And, the one I often point to is that was really a high point for many reasons, was that trip to China, one of several that I had the privilege of undertaking. But this one with Monster Quest, specifically addressing the Yeren question. And if I'm repeating the stories we went over last time, because honestly, I can't remember. I've done, I do so many of these on such a regular basis, I cannot for the life of me remember exactly.
We didn't touch on the Yeren at all. So
okay, all right. Well, this is a good story then, because, I had correspondence with Dr. Zhou Gujing, who was the lead person, the lead academic researching this question. He'd been involved in the International Cryptozoology Society, under the auspices of Richard Greenwell, and he interacted with Dr. Krantz and so forth. He was the paleontologist that really was taking the fore. unfortunately, he experienced some of the same frustrations, I think, that Dr. Krantz, that Grover wrestled with, especially in the twilight of his career. Joe published a paper in the Relic Hominid Inquiry, which is the online refereed professional journal, academic scholarly journal that I edit, and can be readily discovered online just by Googling the Relict with a T, which is the biologically appropriate form of the word, Relic Hominid Inquiry. But Joe published a paper where he sort of went through his retrospective. And unfortunately, he came out of it very pessimistic about the reality of the Yeren. Very equivocal and because he had experienced what we experience so often, repeatedly, and that is footprints that were just ambiguous and in some instances outright hoaxes, hair that invariably, when failed to yield DNA definitively, and in some instances was clearly artificial hair or human hair that had been subjected to chemical treatments in order to lighten it, to give it a red cast, to bleach out the melanin and give it an orangish red cast that more aligned with the descriptions of the Yeren. And it was very negative. But then I had this opportunity to go and not only meet with Joe and see some of the stuff and hear his concerns, but yet I think it sparked. I think my enthusiasm was contagious, and it sparked, rekindled some enthusiasm on his part. And then when we had these remarkable experiences with the footprints, and when so let me lay that out, because that was the clincher. I mean, for me, if you ask for where's the smoking gun, short of a physical specimen, I mean, something like this is just amazing. And that is, we had a witness who had actually been part of the initial state-sponsored expeditions to Hubei province under the auspices of Zhou Gujing and other academics that got on board at the time. They had military support, logistical support, and personnel to assist, and one of those was Mr. Yuan. And But they did all the same sorts of things. They beat the bushes looking for evidence. They collected supposed hair samples. They found a few nondescript footprints. They talked to lots of local witnesses, some of these in very remote areas, who had no contact with any sort of publicized or popular notions of the wild man. But yet, while again it was all intriguing, it didn't bring home the bacon. It didn't have the body, and so as a result, the official position was one of ranging from just inconclusivity to outright rejection of the whole thesis, and so Dr. Joe, instead of being the centerpiece of this sensational scientific expedition to this remote reserve in Hubei province, now he became sidelined, basically. Just same as happened with Dr. Krantz in a way, where he was ridiculed, he was kind of made fun of, and was passed over on promotion and so forth. And so when this doctor, or Mr. Yuan, was so enamored with the countryside, this beautiful region, and underdeveloped, so very rural, very, very inviting, he mustered out of the service and retired there he got a job as a park ranger. Because shortly after this, with all one of the outcomes of the sensational attention to this region was the the government set aside a reserve, the Shenanjia Nature Reserve, which interestingly, the main gates are protected by this very charming set of statues of a wild man family, a Yeren family, guarding the way, and emblazoned on the stone is this big engraving Chinese character, which is the character for the wild man.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And so Mr. Yuan got a job as a park ranger there, and it was while he was there that he had this reported encounter, this remarkable encounter where he was patrolling through the park, and as he was coming up, there was the head of a valley. He was coming up the flank of one side and across the way, so he had a good line of sight of that whole mountainside. There was a big outcrop of rocks, and on that was a big hummock of red fur. He thought it was maybe a bear. So he thought, oh, cool, a bear, And he yells across the way. It was several hundred yards away. He yells across at it, and reportedly it sat up and turned to him, and instead of seeing a snout, and the characteristic ears on top of the head, it was a flat face and broad shoulders, And it proceeded to glare at him and then, slid off the rocks and walked away on two legs. And he was stunned, But he made his way up around the head of the canyon and went in pursuit, tracking it, trying to follow it, and found a spot where it had apparently squatted beside a spring. So there was a muddy bank, and in that soft soil, its imprints had pressed in deeply, and because it squatted with the weight forward on the foot, differentially impressed there, and it produced a pressure ridge proximal to that. He scurried back and retrieved a casting kit, materials, plaster, and so forth, and went and executed two nice plaster casts, a right and a left. So here we are. I've been introduced to him and so forth. He was a funny character. He's quite tall. For Chinese, he's quite tall and takes considerable pride in that fact. He stands probably a good half head to a full head taller than any other man in the village. So, he walks down the street with quite a bit of a stride there. And so the first thing he would do when he'd meet us, he'd extend a hand to shake your hand. He'd pull you in and stand back to back with you to size you up. Well, to his chagrin, at that time, I still had another inch and a half before my back, the discs had collapsed to the point, but I'm still about 6 foot. I was about 6'1" at the time, and there wasn't a member of the team of the crew that wasn't over six. That wasn't under. I'm sorry, it wasn't under 6 foot. And I think the tallest guy was 6'4". One of the cameramen, 6'4", and so. He was a little crestfallen because we all were slightly taller than him. So it was quite a scene when we would go walking down the main street of this little village, and all these small people around us, and there were these giant Americans with this giant Chinese man. Anyway,
I've got a friend of mine moved to China about 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Jeff, teaching English, and he's 6'4", he said he would wander around and people would literally walk up to him in the street and start prodding him and laughing.
Yeah,
because he was so tall. He was like, people would follow him down the street. They couldn't believe it.
Yeah. Well, these and they you don't realize, but they because in so many other European or other locations, people know English. At least the merchants and so forth can do some English for the tourists. In China, no one speaks English. No one speaks English whatsoever. It's not taught in the schools, and they have obviously very little sense of what America is like.
Yeah,
and the things. I mean, just to show you how this is kind of silly, but it just struck me as so quaint, so interesting, so insightful. But I didn't have a beard at the time. I'm trying to remember. No, I just had a mustache at the time. Had a mustache, But I have less so now as I get older. The hair's thinning out. But I used to have quite hairy forearms and the backs of my hands. Don't have hair on my shoulders or anything like that. But even Dr. Gujing, this educated academic, when at one point when he shook my hand, he could not resist reaching out and stroking the hair on my forearm.
Yeah.
And I found this again when on another trip to China to visit a paleontologist. I was finally given permission and invited to come over to examine some of the skeletal remains, including some remarkable skeletons of Homo heidelbergensis with exceptionally complete foot skeletons, which was what I was really aiming for. But again, to help me out, he sent a student who, and some of the younger students now, especially many of the students have come to the U.S. to study. And even in, the non-technical, the non-engineering and computer science courses, I mean, they're paleontologist students and archaeology students. So while they're in America, they learn English. So he designated a student to be my keeper, my tender, which I was very thankful for, because there's no signage in English either.
No.
It's different now since the Olympics were there. But you come into Beijing airport and it's like, okay, there's no, pretty little ladies in their prim outfits like in Korea, where pointing you this way or that way and speaking fluent English. It was like the guys, they just kind of go that way. And but so he was there, had a placard, and so he was with me. But one time we were riding in a taxi or a drive or a car. And the same thing happened. We're sitting side by side. It's kind of a small car, But we're right shoulder to shoulder. And I had a short sleeve shirt on, and he did as well. It was quite warm. But I'm kind of taking in the sights and everything. I happened to glance over, and he's looking down, and he's just fascinated with his perfectly slick, hairless forearms against my, my barbarian-looking hairy arm. I was the wild man. I was the Yeren.
Yes.
But again, he could not resist, and he tentatively reached over. He touched the hair on my forearm. I just laughed, and I said, "Yeah, we're different, aren't we?" And so, anyway, kind of interesting insights. I mean, it certainly affects their view. This whole notion of a hairy hominid, and we see this throughout literary history, that hairiness is equated with wildness.
Yes.
With lack of refinement, lack of civilization, and so forth, more primitiveness, and there was that ethnocentric point of view on the part of early Asian contacts that the European, these hairy Europeans, were just some sort of barbaric, backward race that didn't have any refinements or cultural acumen. But anyway, back to where we were. So here I'm coming over now with the Monster Quest crew, and they've arranged an interview with Mr. Yuan, this now retired park ranger. This is from years ago that this happened. They wouldn't let me. I mean, we couldn't share stories with one another, really. They wouldn't let me see his casts until they wanted to capture the moment, the unveiling, and get my unadulterated reaction on camera. And so as we're in this little van, this little bus with big, windowed bus, driving the crew out to a location they'd selected for, to set up a nice shoot for the interview, I gave Mr. Yuan a reprint of a paper that I have published in which I name the footprints attributed to Sasquatch. It's a ichnotaxonomic name, which is a classification system that's parallel to our Linnaean system.
Yes. So
we're Homo sapiens, but there now is a name for modern human footprints even. And now I can't remember what it was. I shouldn't have brought it up, but I was involved in the paper. It's been long enough. It's Homo something pes. hominipes or something. I'll have to look it up now. But anyway, using that same convention, we named, and the importance of this is not just an arbitrary thing, vacuous kind of exercise. It involves establishing a diagnostic a description, a differential diagnosis, enumerating those characteristics that distinguish this footprint left by whatever, and in most instances, in all instances, by the actual guidelines, it should be applied to extinct species, for which the bones, the skeletal remains, have not yet been discovered. So we haven't a physical skeletal remain of a named species to attach to these footprints, so that they don't and therefore they don't linger in limbo. A new system is devised in order to name the footprints by standard techniques and establish a diagnosis so that they can be discussed. So there is a handle on them to identify them. And so in conversations with practitioners, scholars in the field of ichnotaxonomy, this possibility came up. Dr. Krantz has suggested that on the basis of the footprints alone, we were justified in naming a new species, a Linnaean species. and that just doesn't really, that argument goes too much against the grain. It's never going to be accepted. But my colleagues in ichnotaxonomy says, but what he should have done, and what you can do, is name the footprints. Even though this creature is not extinct, and we're not looking at fossil footprints, nevertheless, the track maker is unknown. Therefore, it provides the basis, the justification for naming the footprints. So anyway, I had this paper in which I had done this, Anthropoidipes ameriborealis, the North American ape foot, basically. Yeah. And I pulled one out of my knapsack. I had brought some with me to share, and it's very, profusely illustrated. I'm a very visual learner and teacher, and so I wanted to convey the visual image, which included a very nice, since the diagnosis draws attention to this midfoot flexibility as expressed in the mid-tarsal break, which produces a mid-tarsal pressure ridge in the footprint on occasion. To illustrate that, I had this very nice 3D scans of the Titmus cast from the Patterson-Gimlin film site, which exhibits this, very good given the substrate. And it's depicted in 3 angled views, this 3D scan. So it's a beautiful figure, very prominently displayed here. And boy, he turns the page, he sees that figure, and he starts thumping the page, and he's excited. He reaches back and he's grabbing my sleeve, and pointing to this. And I go, okay, yeah, I can see you're excited. But, they wouldn't let him show me. But sure enough, we get there, we set up, have the cameras rolling. Out comes his little travel case. He opens it up, some toweling, stuffing comes out, and out come these 2 plaster casts. And they were dead ringers for that Titmus cast. And the only distinction really is just a slight greater breadth overall, but they're almost the same length, just right at about 15, just under 15 inches, just a little bit broader, as I say. The pressure ridge is visible, clearly visible, all 5 toes, just nice and distinct. The pressure ridge not only is there, it is in the right place and at the right orientation. The ridge kind of has it's not perfectly transverse across the footprint, but rather has a slight cant to it because the 2 joints that are involved, the talonavicular and calcaneocuboid joints, are just slightly offset. So the axis of flexion and twisting of the foot is on an axis that is just slightly oblique through the length of the foot. A subtle detail. But you could also, even just this one even had in some greater detail, a little more prominently impressed in that mud, given their depth. the contours of that forefoot that show the differential points of pressure under the head of the talus and the navicular and underneath the cuboid, with the calcaneus twisted and rotated up a bit, in flexion. I was just flabbergasted. I mean, this guy, Mr. Yuan, at one point during a conversation, as it could happen, to the extent it could happen, through the interpreter, asked me, "So, is there anything like the Yeren in America, in the United States?" He was just totally oblivious of the whole phenomenon and of Bigfoot. And I said, well, yeah, that's, and then subsequent to that I gave him that reprint. And then, but what are the odds? And then you look, not only would it been extremely unlikely, if not completely implausible, to suggest that he had somehow copied an example from the U.S., but my conversations, my discussion of the significance of this feature, so visible on the Titmus cast, which hadn't been widely publicized, the cast itself, pictured in only one photograph that I'm aware of, and of course the footprint where you can see that. The correlated footprint, you can see that ridge in a photo taken by Lyle Laverty, who was a timber cruiser for the U.S. Forest Service and had visited the site just days after and had snapped off several several slides, 35 millimeter slides of examples of the footprints, which included that now famous Titmus cast. Very little public awareness. I mean, a few people had commented in writing about the pressure ridge, but had always just dismissed it as nothing but a branch stuck in the sand that had been stepped on and then rebounded, caused thrown up the sand there. And there are some twigs sticking out close by on the side that people have associated with that said, but invisible branch. But the point is, my discussions, my drawing attention to it and reinterpreting it came literally years after Mr. Yuan had already had his encounter, had already made his plaster casts, and they had been publicized in a couple of places in the Chinese literature. But, there was no crosstalk. There was no way, no nexus that can be identified where one could have tainted the other. So we've got these two independent examples, not just of a humanoid kind of, or hominoid, let's say, because it's not really humanoid at all. It differs in significant ways, but a hominoid footprint with a non-divergent big toe. But beyond that, we have the ultimate expression of the distinction, the central distinction in functional morphology between these two foot architectures, and that make real sense when as I said earlier, science is catching up. Science is catching up to be able to interpret the Sasquatch footprint, and walking on bipeds, walking on flat, flexible feet, is now finally, after years of pounding this drum on my part, has been part of the mainstream now, that early bipedal hominins walked on flat, flexible feet, and that the emergence of the modern human arch is a very, Johnny-come-lately feature that distinguishes the latest hominins, especially humans, which have expressed that arch and the gracile skeletal anatomy of the foot, as with the rest of the body, to a much greater degree than observed in any other previous hominin. So it's, smoking gun. Talk about a smoking gun. I mean, how can you account for that?
Yeah.
That's why I get so frustrated with people who say, and so quick to dismiss everything. Someone reveals a hoax, and hoaxes do occur, because that's the nature of the thing and the nature of human nature. but they're so quick to write off everything on the generalization of that one instance or two instances, when we've got hundreds of independent examples that show this remarkably consistent morphology, and many, many examples, correlated examples of the midfoot flexibility as it relates to the pressure ridge, as it relates to half tracks, as it relates to the proportionality evident in obvious pathologies like the Bosberg crippled foot.
Yes.
It's just every time I have not doubts. I never have doubts like that. But you think, boy, when you deal with so many silly silly misinterpretations are the more common than are the hoaxes. Outright intentional hoaxes really are kind of rare, few and far between. Misidentification or overinterpretation, reading too much into ambiguous data, is the much more common thing. But every once in a while, at the end of the week, come Friday, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I've dealt with every single day, one after another after another. I said, is there any? And then every once in a while, there'll be a particular instance that, kind of revitalizes it. But all I have to do is reflect on the conversation, the monologue I've just delivered, and I left just shaking my head. I was just saying, well, there's no way. I mean, I'm absolutely convinced. I'm not like, as some people say, I'm not a knower really in that sense of the word, but I comprehend it. And am as convinced as I can be, short of being a knower.
Yeah. No, I mean, that for me is one of those crucial things as well, because I think some people don't understand how regulated information is in China from outside.
Oh, yeah.
And I find it, like you've referred to there, the chances of somebody getting hold of a Bigfoot cast from some case in North America at some point, to then hold it in China for a certain number of years and try and address a hoax several years later is almost inconceivable. I'm sure, as with anything, Jeff, that people will have been able to get all kinds of things from outside of China and bring them in. As it always happens, we always got told that nobody in Russia knew anything about the West, and yet they were all buying Levi jeans and loving rock music that apparently they had no access to, but somehow they all had them. That's strange how these things work.
Yep.
But for somebody to go out of their way to get something that would be so similar to something captured from Bluff Creek and hold it there on the off chance that a group of scientists or a TV crew from North America might turn up one day is ludicrous.
Exactly. Yeah, even more so. I hadn't even thought about that angle of it, but yeah, because I tried. We through the cast, under the guise of interest by the crew and so forth. Let's take these back to America to be studied, and so we can photograph them and properly and blah blah blah. And Mr. Yuan wouldn't have it. He tried, to his credit, to make a replica. I had to depart before the whole crew left, and so I really, I wanted to be. I'd taken lots of photographs.
Yeah.
And if we had done this now with an iPhone and LiDAR, I could have easily scanned them, which would have been really nice to have had that capability. But so I took lots of photographs from all angles, and I have published a paper, I've presented on it at professional meetings, the significance of the footprint evidence for the Chinese Yeren. And so we've at least got that. But I really had hoped that they would come through and at the very least get replicas made in the time they were there beyond my departure. And they said when that Mr. Yuan there was another gentleman and whose name now escapes me. He was kind of a local. It's really interesting. Just another diversion really quickly, but I guess it's not surprising, but it was interesting to observe because human nature is so consistent, even cross-culturally, to a large extent. But just as in America, when the official position became much more circumspect after the sort of equivocal results of this state-sponsored massive expedition in the late 70s, when the official institutional interest was diminished, into that void moved the amateur enthusiasts. And there are actually these little groups, just like in America, of amateur investigators who go out. They have their kit, and tents and everything, and go out into the field in those areas where they're allowed. Some places you obviously can't camp, like in the nature reserve. It's not really permitted to go camping, but except perhaps with special permission. We got permission to do one overnight with the camera crew, which was an interesting experience too. But because we had our tenders and keepers and police officers with us, and but they were just chummy as can be. It wasn't any kind of stoic, ominous, intimidating presence. I mean, the vodka was flowing freely, and they were enjoying all the meal packs and things that we'd brought along and so forth. And we had a great time around the campfire and doing our investigations in the blinds and cutting for cut sign and so forth. Anyway, it was fun. It was interesting, fun as well as informative. But the point being is this pattern has paralleled that we have here in the U.S., where into the void has stepped the amateur enthusiast. And I don't say amateur in a pejorative way. I mean, people bring lots of skills and talents and abilities, insights to bear. It's just that they're not professional academics or professional, wildlife biologists or whatever, park rangers, so forth. Hopefully they're rising to the label of citizen scientist and applying good, common sense, objective, rational criteria to their investigations. But there was this one gentleman who was kind of our point man in the field in that region. And it's funny because he was just very, he was still very affable, very friendly, but he was very disciplined and what do I want to say? Prim in a way. And I said, I leaned over to one of our fixers, one of our local native fixers, and I said, "So, what is his story? He had to have been in the military, right?" And she says, "Oh, yes. He was in the secret police. If he was a captain in the secret police." So he was very disciplined, very military, very. But you saw that in the way he conducted himself in the field and just the presence, the presence that he had when he was in a room or in a group. So it was really quite interesting. But still, he was affiliated with and kind of headed up one of these little local groups of enthusiasts. They would get together on their weekends. Some of them were retired, and they'd go off in the field. And
it's remarkable, really, that, as you say, it can be so culturally different.
Yeah.
And yet we're very similar as well, because, like you say, there'll be. I would imagine there'll be people doing the same in Russia. There'll be people. Well, we know there are people doing the same thing in Australia.
Absolutely.
But as you mentioned, in regards to how the Chinese culture view hairy people, I mean, God knows what they think of my arms, because they're very similar to the sound of yours. So they'd be having a field day, I think, there. But it's this concept that you see in some of the early reports from North America in the sort of 19th century, when they start being reported, that there is this perception, Jeff, that if somebody leaves civilization or a hermit, they just suddenly become a very hairy person. And it makes you chuckle, I think, when you look back at some of these newspapers. I remember when I was reading through Chad Arnott's Bigfoot history book, which is incredible. It's a brilliant book, but it's the worst book to read in bed because you strain your shoulders holding that up.
Yeah,
it's a brilliant book to read laying down or on a desk, I think. But the amount of stories that everybody says, oh, well, it's old Steve who used to be a gold miner and he went mad. And now he's living in the woods and he's just become completely hairy. Yeah. And so even though you are an ocean apart, they still have that concept that hair means wild. Yeah, absolutely. And often when you look at some of these older reports, I've often said this, because people dismiss some of the newspaper stories from late 19th century America and Canada, where people are talking about, they must have known about gorillas or they've read about gorillas. And I think, well, firstly, I think you underestimate just how many people could actually read in 1870. Right. Yeah. And also the access to having a newspaper that would be covering discoveries from Africa, for God's sake.
That's right. Yeah, no, there was no National Geographic magazine circulating and no television cable channel documentaries at all. So, yeah.
I mean, even if you want to be as flippant as say, well, they didn't even have radio. Never mind anything else.
Right. Absolutely. It's true. It's true. It's very, and yet word, percolates, but as it's like the old telegraph game. You can imagine that if a story was released about a description of a gorilla, or a gorilla brought back to the UK by some expedition, and word kind of got picked up by the press, and a story made it to the States, and it kind of trickled through the newspapers. But you can just imagine how through the retelling, how that could be remarkably modified or embellished or whatever. And it goes even a step further too, when you look at native cultures in areas where there are great apes, whether it's Borneo and Sumatra or in Africa. Those tribes have very overt traditional beliefs that, one, either that they emerged from these very man-like, these anthropomorphic apes, or if a person was indolent, was lazy, was just, had no ambition, that they would revert back. And that accounted for the existence of these wild people. These orang-utan is the wild man of the woods.
Yes.
Or the man of the forest. And so they considered them man-like in that respect. They recognized that similarity. And so yeah, it, and this is, some resort to these observations as an explanation, a rationale for everything, for relating to relic hominoids, that it's nothing more than just a manifestation of these kinds of cultural interpretations or projections of humanity onto the wild, the natural world. On the other hand, we can see so many parallels where very common, now familiar forms of wildlife were embellished in their descriptions or formed the basis of moralistic lessons, Aesop's fables that point to sort of characteristic traits that have been attributed, the clever fox, the fleet rabbit, and this, that, and the other, the industrious ant.
Yes.
Just so on. And so so the flip side is we shouldn't be surprised that there is that dimension, there's that facet. The absence of it in association with the empirical perception or the stories of relic hominoids would itself raise suspicion that this was not normal. That, so the fact that you have these identifiable features, which aren't universal, which aren't found in every culture, as sometimes is generalized, just like Bigfoot doesn't exist, in my opinion, in every state of the Union, despite assertions, every story is given undue credence, every bump in the night, every strand of hair or whatever.
Yes.
It nevertheless, it doesn't surprise me that there would be embellishments. There would be stories. I mean, a good case in point that's kind of charming in itself is the Ministry of Culture in Canada, in cooperation with some of the First Nations, who were concerned that some of their traditions, some of their rituals were in danger of being lost on the subsequent generations, decided maybe it was time to archive, to document these things. And so working with the Ministry of Cultures, they had filmed depictions of some of their ceremonial dances, for example. And there are two that are really good. I mean, one is the Bukwas and one is the Tsonakwa. Yes. But the chief who is introducing this portrayal, this performance, and he's actually singing the chant, the song, and beating the drum. He starts off by saying that these stories of the Tsonakwa that catch naughty children. He said we tell these stories to our children, kind of like the boogeyman, to keep them in good behavior. Yeah. And he chuckles. His laughter is just, it's just like, oh yeah, we use these as the boogeyman story. I mean, yeah, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean they don't take it very seriously. This represents an entity that has a very integral position in their worldview. And anyway, it's just, I think there's both sides, and yes. You're amiss if you ignore one or put precedence on one over the other without recognizing, acknowledging their interrelatedness.
Well, exactly. And also, when you look at that kind of experience where the chief was saying such things, it's also a culture and a history and a population that were very aware of the natural predators that would be quite happy to munch down on somebody who was wandering too far away. Yeah. You don't need to create another creature when you've got bears and wolves and cats who will pick you off.
That's very true. Yeah, yeah. I mean, this was an argument. There was actually an article that had a title to that very theme. It says, Bigfoot in Alaska, we don't need any more monsters. We have, the Kodiak bear, the grizzly bear has plenty monstrous enough. And so they were trying to argue that actually there is no tradition of Bigfoot in Alaska because there's no need for it. Well, they were wrong. Whoever wrote that article had not done their research, and obviously the Bushman is widespread and has deep roots in the native cultures, as well as contemporary accounts of encounters. I mean, they're widespread, and there's remarkable habitat. I mean, it's, as I have pointed out, now the brown bear is a little different story that I haven't grappled with entirely, but as far as correlation of habitat preference with black bear populations, there seems to be a remarkable congruence between the distribution of credible, substantiable, documented reports of Bigfoot and the distribution of black bear. And that makes perfect sense when two large omnivore species would have some similarities in their fundamental dietary and habitat requirements. But yet, I mean, even black bear, the fact that black bear and grizzly bears coexist in extents of their ranges, it's not that they're without some competition. And certainly there is niche partitioning. There are very different strategies employed by the two in their dietary profiles. So we can easily parse out another profile for a large omnivorous primate that has a very distinct chewing apparatus, that probably, as a large primate, has a very different gut morphology and physiology that allows them to exploit resources that would be unavailable to a more a bear species that is derived from a more carnivorous ancestor, as opposed to a Sasquatch that's probably derived from a frugivore folivore ancestor originally, which was the generalized hominoid adaptation. So there are ways that you can parse them. And as far as misidentifications, what was his name? Joel Nichols wrote a article for the Skeptical Inquirer, I think it was, on Bigfoot lookalikes, trying to argue that Bigfoot were just bear misidentifications. Now, it does come into play. This is that you never say never, because I deal with lots of misidentified bear footprints, bear tracks, and people see a flash of fur. I mean, I had a close encounter with a bear when we were out doing field research in the Blues outside of Walla Walla, and we were kind of spread out doing a picket line going up off trail up through this valley. Yeah. And all of a sudden someone says, "It's over here," and you heard the brush pop, crack, and I wheeled around just in time to see this flash of black fur through the gaps in the shrub layer, disappeared down the slope. And later we found the footprints, and it was a black bear. But you can see how someone, a very enthusiastic, I mean, they're there for one purpose and one purpose alone, and seeing a bear doesn't quite rise to that significance. But boy, if that flash of fur might have been a Bigfoot, and I have no reason to say it wasn't a Bigfoot, other than the laws of probability or the statistics of probabilities, but. I can see how people can easily, go down that path. So that's a real thing. But any clear view, any opportunity to observe, as I said, I mean, just the snout and the ears on top of the head are dead giveaways. The sloping shoulders, the short legs, low crotch. Those are all distinguishing characteristics that are very different than an upright, square-shouldered, long-legged, flat-faced, ears on the side of its head, hair-covered hominoid.
Yeah. There are so many witness accounts where, as we said the first time we spoke, it's not the fact that people might be inexperienced into what you're seeing. And yes, everybody can mistake things. We've all seen things that we think, oh, what was that? Because like you say, you get a glimpse of it and you think, oh, and it sometimes takes you a few seconds to suddenly grasp what it probably is. I mean, it happened to me a few weeks ago where I was convinced a pair of corgi dogs were running down the road at midnight, and then common sense kicked in. And I thought, well, they're clearly badgers. They're not corgis. But I'd never seen a badger in this area, despite the fact I know that there are dozens and dozens of them that live here. I've seen foxes galore. Right. But urban badgers are a very common thing here in the UK. But you've got to be quite fortunate, because they're obviously our largest official carnivore outside of the ABCs, our mysterious black cat population that we have. But they're very rarely spotted. And so it was only after 10, 20 seconds, I suddenly realised the fact it's less likely to be a pair of corgi dogs running down the street at midnight
under those
than a pair of badgers. And it was a pair of badgers, and it was the claws on the pavement. And they were off, and I've never seen any badgers since. So, but I know they're everywhere around here, because lots of neighbours have sort of backyard cams for their foxes and their badgers, and so there's dozens of them around here.
Very good, yeah. Interesting. Yeah, it's always, our powers of observation, our ability to interpret what we see, has to be held to a high standard, I guess is one way to say it. You just, one of the things, and I don't remember if we talked about this, there was a paper, I was asked to review a paper for a journal, and it was actually a former colleague down in Arizona of Richard Greenwell. And they had started a project where they were doing some analysis of eyewitness accounts and evaluating them from various, using various metrics and various perspectives of interpreting the significance of these sightings reports. And in the introductory material, I was particularly drawn to, they had reviewed some of the much more recent literature on the credibility, the reliability of eyewitness testimony, because the pendulum had swung considerably to the negative side in the wake of work by Elizabeth Loftus, who was a psychologist if I get that right, who specialized in the study of human memory. And she gained some notoriety. She's written some books and publications, but her real notoriety came as she was an expert witness in a number of adjudications that involved regressed memories. And her thesis was that memory was extremely unreliable, that it was very malleable, it was, in her words, reconstructive, and that that it doesn't exist. The memory of that event does not exist independently, and you just tap into it. You literally reassemble it from lots of different sensory modalities and all of the processing and association and so forth that takes place. And every time the very act of remembering impacts, it can artificially reinforce or embellish or suppress aspects of your memory, and being questioned by other people actually influences your recollection. This is the great demonstration of this is the very classic exercise where a trained interviewer starts to talk to a person about their memories and starts to feed them little wisps of a memory of having been lost as a child in the mall. And these very talented interviewers, after 10, 15 minutes of questioning, they have these people not only acknowledging that, yes, indeed, that's right, I was lost in the mall, but then they start remembering like the clerk that helped them, or the security guard that came and sat with them while they looked for their mother, and they remember how they were crying because they were so afraid they had lost their mom. All of this was just a suggested memory. And so anyway, the point is, because of Elizabeth Loftus's work, many people then began to completely dismiss the usefulness of eyewitness testimony in this context of anomalous creatures. And so now there has been work, and again, I'm shooting from the hip, so I can't remember the name of the more recent scholar who has kind of pushed the pendulum back the other way, because his argument is, well, those are important caveats, those are important qualifications that need to be borne in mind. But hey, look, we have survived and been successful as a species because we have pretty reliable memories of things, where the fruiting tree was, where the deer, game trails are, where this, that, and the other, where to dig the mushrooms or the roots and pick the mushrooms. Those kinds of, he points out through numerous studies that actually under the appropriate conditions, human recollection is remarkably reliable and accurate. And so they opened up their reconsideration of this eyewitness data. Now, in my review, I not only reviewed the manuscript, but I was asked to write a review, a commentary, along with several other people that was published with the paper. And I took the opportunity to point out, my interest focuses on the footprints. So unlike the memory, there's a physical trace.
Yes.
There's an objective documentation of the piece of evidence in question. And what I find is that as people submit for my consideration all these different examples of possible Sasquatch footprints, there's just a lot of chaff. If you simply relied on their verbal testimony that they had witnessed Sasquatch footprints on this day, at this location, and it measured this length and this breadth, and there were, 3 discernible footprints, and you had that narrative as the sole source of your information without the actual footprint, then, you would register all these different accumulating accounts of footprint discoveries. But where you have some documentation, a photograph or a footprint cast, then you can evaluate how reliable is that narrative. And what I find that is in the vast majority, it's completely unreliable. They're potholes, they're scuff marks that are just indeterminate, completely indeterminate. And there's no reason to think that it's any more likely to be a Sasquatch than a deer pawing, looking for a mushroom or something. Or they're misidentified bear tracks, or very common human tracks, even sometimes in unusual places. There's a lot of popularity to these toed running shoes.
Yes.
And they leave a fairly distinctive, sometimes they have very distinct logos, but when they're worn down or when the imprint is indistinct, you don't always see those. But the wedge-shaped toes have a pretty distinctive look. But still, they have an arched, and they have narrow heels. There are distinctions. The point being is, if my assessment of the footprint data is so, it represents a very selective subset of reliable information, what does that say about the eyewitness testimony, where you don't have any means except perhaps, and even that's not great if there are multiple witnesses, or if, depending on the viewing conditions, the period of observation.
Yeah.
I mean, having multiple witnesses, you can reinforce a imagined or embellished observation very easily.
Yeah.
And input those, reinforcements into your reconstruction of your experience. So it's tough. It's tough.
Yeah.
You hope that with enough data, the outliers, the signal to noise ratio is sufficient that there are in fact some patterns there, even though there's a lot of noise, and that the real outliers fall away as anomalous, extraordinary examples. But that's the challenge of working in the absence of the definitive physical, conclusive physical specimen.
I suppose as well, it's sometimes frustrating. I mean, there's a paranormal show over here called Uncanny, and they did something similar about testing people's recall, where they kind of set up a false situation where someone would walk into a room where someone was giving a lecture, they'd steal a laptop and run off, and then everybody was asked to describe what they were wearing, colour of their hair and everything. But they'd put someone in there who was feeding them all false information. And I thought, well, yes, that's very interesting. I appreciate that you, as you referred to there about the skilled interviewers being able to create a false narrative about being lost as a child.
Right.
And I'm always a little bit frustrated when they do those kinds of examples, because it's easy to show how quickly you can spin it and change it and create this imagined characterization of what you believe you saw. Mm-hmm. But we never see the opposite, where there isn't any of that going on. Right. And so for me, maybe it's just me being finicky, Dr. Meldrum, but I like the comparison, because I know that memory is malleable. It can be twisted and turned with the right stimulus. Mm-hmm. But I want to know what happens when it's done cold and people aren't being deliberately misled. Right. And they have to organise it yourself, like you say. Multiple witnesses often are put forward in numerous examples of strange phenomena as being a better example. Because therefore you have more viewpoints. But as you quite rightly point out, they can contaminate each other even if they think they're not doing it. Somebody will say, oh, well, it's what I saw a UFO and it had white lights. And somebody will say, well, I thought they were yellow. Yeah. And then somebody else will say, well, actually, I thought they were orange. And then you're like, hang on a minute. What's going on here then? We've now they've all seen something, but they all say different coloured lights. That's right. And it's very similar in those kinds of things. But strangely enough, I was watching something about the Yeti yesterday. And what I've noticed over the last 10 years is that people seem to be quite happy to say, well, we think it's an undiscovered bear species. I think primarily because of the work Brian Sykes did in in his series that was done over here through Channel 4 and then obviously shown around the world, where he was looking into those kinds of things.
On that, if I may interject a footnote for your listeners, I reviewed his book in depth and provided a lot of that, because this is one of those cases where I had firsthand interaction with Daniel very early on. At the time, shortly after he had his initial experience and documented the footprints. And I was very disappointed to read his overgeneralization. But anyway, that review, that in-depth essay-style review, is posted in the Relic Hominid Inquiry. I'd encourage since it sounds like it got much more widespread dispersal there than over here, that take a look at that and weigh his conclusion there. But you're right. Go ahead.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you. You're always welcome to interject. And so I can see now that a lot of mainstream scientists, when they're talking about this, they go, "Oh," and the example I was watching last night, they were saying, and it's one of those things that really annoys me when somebody from the West start talking about a different culture. And they were saying, well, you know what those kinds of people are like. And I was like, I'm pretty sure that regardless of whether you're Nepalese, Tibetan, or you live in China, you know the difference between a bear and something that isn't a bear. Because for some of the reports that you will get and the eyewitnesses, one of the things about Yeti reports is that a lot of people say they're quite aggressive, and there are people who have claimed to have been knocked unconscious, attacked, seen their yaks and their horses mutilated and killed in front of them.
Right.
I don't care how shocking an event is, you're not going to think, oh my God, it's a bear, but I can't imagine that, and therefore I've now created a hairy humanoid type figure doing this instead, Dr. Meldrum.
Right. Well, one thing to bear in mind, I was always puzzled about the reactions or the identifications by locals of footprints as Yeti, which, if published, and some of our past mountaineers of historical notoriety were a bit sly about actually publishing their photos, because the story is much better. Story sells, but a disqualifying photo can kind of put a fly in the ointment. Smith was one that was notorious in his books. He schlepped along this great photographic equipment and took pictures, which were sent back to the scientists like Arthur Keith and so forth back in England, and but then when he published his book, he didn't include any of the photos. So I tracked him. I tracked down his heir,
yes,
who had the estate, and I introduced myself and my motivation and so forth. And so he was very nice and gave me a proof sheet of the negatives.
Wow.
And but he had watermarks on them and was seeking remuneration if I wanted to order any. But it was enough to show me what was going on, and they were clearly bear. They were unmistakably bear. So here's a situation where Smith looks at it and he goes, it kind of looks like a bear, but he goes, his Sherpas were adamant. No, Sahib, no, that's Yeti. They wouldn't go any further because it was because of the stigma attached to them. They were convinced it was Yeti. And I'm thinking, okay, are these Sherpas who we hold in such high regard as these men of integrity and courage and so forth, are they so disingenuous that they're going to tell the Westerner whatever it is they think they might want to hear? Or are they so naive as to their own natural history, their own surroundings, that they don't know the difference between a bear track and the bear sign and something else, something anomalous like an ape-like footprint? Well, then it occurred to me, I came upon a little booklet that was actually about the Yeti that was written by a native Nepalese gentleman, and one passage in there caught my eye, and it was, to the Sherpa, the Yeti is the spirit of the mountain. It's the spirit, the essence, the spirit of the mountain, which can manifest itself corporeally in any of a variety of forms, be it a bear, be it man-like ape, be it a pilgrim. So when these footprints are found, when a bear track is found up in one of these high mountain passes, which when the bear's just doing the same thing that probably the Yeti would be doing if it were Yeti prints, going from one valley to the next and crossing the snowfield up over the pass into the next adjacent valley. To the Yeti, there shouldn't be a bear. A bear can't make a living up there in the snowfields, high elevation. So it's anomalous, it's out of place. Therefore, it must be the spirit of the mountains leaving spore up here. And so therefore it's Yeti. So they can assert with absolute certainty that this is the Yeti, even though it's clearly, to our mind, to an objective, rational point of view, it is a bear. So I think that might account for, quite honestly, the Yeti is a big muddle, the Yeti phenomenon, because of this very thing. There have been so many tracks that have been attributed to the Yeti, which are either clearly bear, or they're so nondescript they could be anything. And so because they can't be definitively assigned to anything, any one thing, let's call it a Yeti. And so when I had a student one time who was interested, she wanted to go into forensic anthropology. And so she was very interested, amongst many other things, she was curious about my interest in footprints. So could I do a project, she said, about footprints of some kind? Well, this very question was pressing on my mind at the time. And I said, there are lots of tables in various publications listing all these encounters with Yeti sightings and Yeti footprints, and yet there are very few, with the exception of that iconic image of the Shipton Ward's footprint, which is anomalous, and I'll explain that in a minute, perhaps, if we have time. But I said, let's see if we can, if you're interested in doing this with me, let's see how many examples of Yeti footprints we can document, we can find photographs of, or careful drawings or whatever. And this was how we identified and contacted Smith's son in that process. But I've got a filing cabinet just full of files with dozens and dozens of footprints that have over the years been attributed to the Yeti. And there's only a meager few, 3, that I can, with confidence. The Shipton Ward footprint is not a bear, as despite Daniel Taylor's conclusion and his interpretation, which he seems to rest his final conclusion on, that there are marks that are claws next to the Shipton footprint. There's a photograph of and sketches of the Shipton footprints that show the ice axe that is next to it. Instead, one has the ice axe and one has a boot, Ward's boot. Well, that ice axe, if you look at it and its dimensions, there's a sketch that was made, presumably from either another photograph or where the ice axe had initially been laid down on the other side of the print. And if you look at the edges and the dimensions, those, quote, claw marks that are unmistakable claw marks in Daniel's conclusion are simply that initial impression of the ice axe. Anyway, it has nothing to do. It's not a bear. It's no more likely.
Not a rabbit either, because that's always been put forward as well, isn't it? A rabbit.
A rabbit? Oh, well, there's this one. I think I can see some anatomy.
Yes.
Of a hominoid footprint, but it's a pathology. It's suffering from a pathology known as, if it's not a rabbit, or just it has a condition known as macrodactyly.
Yes.
And if you look up macrodactyly, it usually affects the second, maybe the third, the first and or the second toes. They tend to hypertrophy, both the soft tissue and the skeletal tissue. And I've I've got images, photos from orthopedic books, textbooks that show cases in usually they're infant feet, because usually surgical correction is undertaken fairly early to try to so it'll grow into a normally proportioned foot. But you put it up alongside the Shipton footprint, and it's a dead ringer.
Yeah.
Now, I hate to plead a special case, but it is, a good argument can be made for it. Now, given that qualification, I always cringe that this has become the iconic image. The much more iconic image, I think, should be the McNeely-Cronin expedition footprints to the Yeren Valley, the expedition to Yeren Valley,
yes.
where they found footprints in situ where something had walked bipedally up a slope. They were camped on the shoulder of a ridge. They were about to go over into the adjacent valley and continue a survey, a subset of the team, which included Cronin and a couple of others, Ames.
Yes.
Anyway, but they woke up the next morning to find footprints meandering in amongst their tents, around their tents, that had not been touched by the sun, had not been snowed upon. They were crisp, sharp-edged, and it looks like a chunky chimpanzee with a divergent big toe and longer lateral digits. The toe isn't sticking way out like a thumb. It's kind of held in close to the others, but that's not at all uncommon. I've got footprints of gorillas and chimps walking in snow that show the same posture. In any case, they backtracked and found where it had come up the hillside in 3 feet snow, hands never touched, only the hind feet. It was on the ridge, spied their tents, apparently meandered around to investigate, came back to the ridge, continued on. They followed it until they lost the trail in a rhododendron thicket on the slopes of the other side of the pass. So they cast it. Unfortunately, it was confiscated at the border. The Border Patrol agents, when they asked, well, what's this? This massive, this is really cool. This is a Yeti. Oh, well, you can't take that. That's a national treasure. And they confiscated it and it promptly disappeared.
Yeah.
But they have photographs of the cast, photographs of the prints. Anyway, I've done a really an inferential reconstruction based on the footprint, based on the impressions of the cast, which isn't a great cast. I mean, in snow, it's hard to make a cast.
Yes.
What emphasizes or reinforces my interpretation, however, is that in our casting about, our feeling about exploring, finding additional contacts, there was another cast attributed to Hutchinson, who was a writer, correspondent, and amateur mountaineer who did a lot of climbing and so forth. And he had encountered some footprints and has a photograph that's a dead ringer for the McNeely-Cronin. So that tells me a couple of things. First of all, there's very little footprint evidence for the Yeti. Yeah. The classic Yeti that we think of anyway as the sort of man-sized, and as you said, sometimes aggressive, probably a form of an ape, that inhabits the subtropical forests of the valleys, and on occasion will disperse or go back and forth across those snowfields on rare occasions. But we've only got those 2 or 3 examples of anything that can't be identified as a bear or is so nondescript that you can't attribute it to anything. So there is bear mixed into the lore. Yeah. And unfortunately, people like Daniel Taylor and Messner, Reinhold Messner, have jumped on that bandwagon and have promoted the bear explanation to the exclusion of all else. Yeah. And in the process have made themselves out to look kind of silly. I mean, with the prints that Messner publishes in his book, I mean, nobody with any experience, even armchair experience with bear sign, would look at that photograph and think that it's anything other than a brown bear footprint. And so to even suggest that this somehow is associated with his strange, narrative encounter of this upright standing chimo, this bipedal bear, it just becomes really, really strange. So it's a problem. You sit here, you end up peeling the layers of the onion off, and you're left with just, basically just a few tidbits that actually suggest the possibility of a relict ape species inhabiting the high Himalayan valleys.
It is interesting, I think, because Yeti fever took off here in the 1950s from some of the, obviously, whilst everybody was desperately trying to scale Everest. And that's where it all kind of started for. And the 1950s here, everybody was out there.
Oh, sure.
Tom Slick got involved. Peter Byrne was out there. You'd got Hillary, Shipton.
Sure. And it was a great hook for financing, for sponsorships.
Absolutely.
It's a lot sexier to be there looking for the mysterious Yeti, as well as trying to find a new route to the summit.
And so it's always been there. And Mesner's is a very strange one, because I'm old enough to know I've seen the change from the story over the last 30 years. It seems to have changed 3 times, and what it is now doesn't seem to be what it was when it was originally released. I mean, I've got Mesner's book, which was printed. The copy I've got is probably about 30 years old. Obviously, his perception has changed now that he's completely embraced, I saw a weird new species of bear.
Bear, yeah, I know. Oh, I know. Well, and it was so, if you see his, and I hate to wax excessively negative, but there's so much tripe that you have to kind of brush to the side of the table. It's just, I mean, if you watch his that documentary he appeared in, where with let's see, Mark Evans was the host.
Yep.
And Mark's a good guy, but Mark toes the party line when it comes to the script. Yeah. He tells the story that he's given, that he's handed. Unfortunately, that was the experience. I've had a couple of interactions with Mark, and they've been fun, and it's great to get to know him and so forth. But I'll have to share a couple. But one was, but the one that drives me nuts is when he goes to Reinhold's to Messner's castle, and there's this mount that he's so proud of, this taxidermy mount of a bear, and it's the worst amateur mount of a bear that likes to chase parked cars, has this flat face, and it's weird. And then they have stuck in these teeth that aren't their teeth; they're dog teeth, and there aren't incisors. He's got molars and premolars stuck across the front here, and so they go over to the mount, and it was Mark Peterson and also Sykes was with him, and they pluck off a hair, put it in the little Eppendorf tube, and take it in and test it. And guess what? When you pluck a hair off of a bear pelt, the DNA reveals that it's a bear. And I just like, it's like, oh, one of these. Huh? And then, when they came to my lab. Here's one other behind the scenes. Because this didn't make the cut. When they came to my lab, Mark was all excited. Oh, I've got something to show you. I've got, we've got some evidence. And I'm thinking, oh, boy, maybe they really found something. And he's got a box, and it's all wrapped up and taped. And so they come in, and they got the cameras going, with the handheld. So it's very, very Blair Witch kind of style photography, and he's cutting it back and pulling back the paper toweling and bubble wrap, and out comes this cast. Well, the cat, I look at it and I go, yeah, it's a nice bear print. What is that? What you were going to show me? And he goes, what are you talking about? I said, I just looked at him and said, well, it's a bear. And I just reached over, because I've got, all over my lab bench, there's examples, and I grabbed an example of a very large California black bear, beautiful set of footprints, where an overstep, so you've got the fore and hind paw, just really nice. And so I just started pointing out the identifying features. Well, this is the print, if you've seen the documentary, and Mark is out there with And so I'm doing pretty good at pulling names out of my hat here. But it's the guy who works with bears, who has Bart the bear.
Oh, yes.
Or is it Brutus? It's Brutus. Bart is the one who passed away.
Yeah,
Brutus
Bart was the one who was in...
Yes, he was in that one. He was also in The Edge with Alec Baldwin and Anthony Hopkins.
Hopkins, yes.
He has a great appearance there when he lip quivers.
Oh, yeah, it's amazing to think he's a trained bear. It's remarkable.
Yeah, he's great. Anyway, so what they did is they set up a little trackway with overturned, loosened up dirt, raked out nice and flat, and then they actually had to put an electric fence to keep Brutus in the trackway, and then they had him walk, and he gave them a beautiful registered overstep. So here's the forepaw and the hind paw steps in just such a way that it makes almost a continuous footprint. And so they show that on camera. But then they didn't show my assessment of it. Instead, where I, stick the needle in the balloon and pop it for them, instead they do this ridiculous superimposition of that track on the Shipton photo. And I told them right at the beginning when we first started talking about this interview, I said, you're barking up the wrong tree. The Shipton is iconic. I mean, it's historic.
Yeah.
But it's not normal, anatomy. It's not what we think a Yeti footprint would look like. I says, you need to focus on the McNeely Cronin print, and it's very attainable. And Jeff McNeely, I'm sure, would do an interview. Edward Cronin got over into finance banking, and he left natural history altogether and doesn't even like to talk about it anymore, even though he's the one who wrote the book. The best chapter of the Yeren Valley, that chapter in there on the footprint is great reading and required reading. But I said, that's what you should be focused on. No. See, they had their story already laid out. They had their script. They already had their itineraries and so forth, so they weren't going to be bothered.
Do you think that's because they got the DNA claiming it was a bear? Because I think this was the thing that surprised people, was that they ended up getting a DNA result of a species of polar bear in the Himalayas, and therefore they were more, as soon as they got that, they were like, well, that explains everything else, and they weren't bothered if those prints didn't match, or they were basically trying to shoehorn an explanation into the evidence.
They definitely were, and it was. And I'm trying to remember all the details. It's been a long time since or not a long time, but a while. But they what they did is they had a sample. They had a sample, which when they submitted it for comparison to the GenBank or the whatever the database was for the sequence, the thing that popped up was this fossilized jaw from Norway.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that fossilized jaw that dates back, I don't know how many tens of thousands of years, was recognized as a hybrid.
Yeah.
It was a hybrid between a polar bear and a brown bear. That's not at all uncommon, and especially in periods when the polar caps waxed and waned. When they wane, the polar bears spend more time on the shorelines of the Arctic nations, and they interact with brown bear. So the comparison,
as it's happening now.
Yes. So the comparison of the similarities between the sample from Nepal and the sample from Norway were the genes of the brown bear contribution, not the polar bear contribution. Polar bears have nothing to do with Nepal. And to even suggest it immediately pulled the rug of credibility out from under their feet. I mean, it was ludicrous. And people took shots at them. There were editorials and commentaries that were published and were online. They thought, this is ridiculous. I mean, it was bad science.
Yeah.
And again, you hate to speak ill of the dead, but I was just really disappointed that Sykes would go down that path. It was the explanation was so obvious.
Yeah.
It was just a total misdirection. Had nothing to do. And so then, and it spawned all these ridiculous. I mean, there was this one, I can picture this one article, and it had a picture of a polar bear unzipping this costume, and out pops a Yeti, And so It was, yeah. That's why I say this whole thing has gotten muddled. Sykes' book, and then Daniel Taylor Ides, Daniel Taylor, he dropped the Ide. Daniel Taylor are just irresponsibly misdirecting the uninformed reader. Yeah. And there's just, that's why, like I said, I encourage your viewers to go to that review that I posted, that I had published. It was reviewed and posted and published in the Relic Hominid Inquiry for the real story, and pictures of his original experience. He found bear tracks, but he was so hypoxic that he imagined, he hallucinated, was delusional, and thought for sure that he had seen Yeti tracks. And even one of his own colleagues, and I couldn't believe he wrote this in his book. His one colleague was saying to him, because he snapped off like 2 or 3 pictures of the actual footprints, just a couple of pictures, and just to show how he wasn't thinking straight. His colleague said to him, 2 pictures of a possible Yeti print? He said, why didn't you take 3 rolls of pictures? He said, I can't. He says, it just doesn't seem reasonable that you only took 2 pictures. And so there's nothing to show the context, nothing to show the pattern of the trackway. But when you look at the casts, there's no question they're bear. It's bear, And so to say the footprints that I thought were Yeti turned out to be bear, therefore all tracks attributed to Yeti must be bear. Yeah. Where's the logic in that?
Exactly.
That doesn't make any sense. But that's the thesis. That's the premise, the conclusion he draws in his book.
Yeah, I find it frustrating as well, because one of the best recent documentaries about the Yeti for me was when Josh Gates went a few years ago.
Yeah.
And it was really interesting because it turned him round, because I think obviously he's a very open-minded man. Yeah. And you've worked with him several times over the years.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm a big fan of his work. I'll watch anything Josh does, because I love history, I love mysteries, I love strangeness, and so does Josh, it would seem.
Exactly.
And so when he went there, obviously I met a couple of mutual friends of ours. Adam Davis, I think, was out there as well, helping him. It was interesting on 2 levels. One, he really had a very odd experience, and they got some very interesting evidence and some casts there that made Josh think, well, yeah, I think there is something happening here. It's quite obvious that it isn't just superstition. Yep. But I remember in that there were 2 pieces of footage that they got from Japan, which clearly showed an upright, hairy humanoid figure walking on a mountain ridge at an elevation and in an area where nobody was. And people just go, oh, that's weird. Well, no, we're in the Himalayas. It's not like this is on the Appalachians or in the Rocky Mountains, where there could conceivably be a possibility of somebody faking it. You're in the most dangerous mountain range in the world. This is not the place you take a hairy costume to try and pull a practical joke on people.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I'm not familiar with the Japanese film that you're referring to. I'll have to research that. I do have firsthand experience with Josh's footprints, and they were really quite intriguing. They looked very odd at first glance because of the remarkable splay. But the first thing I did was go over to the drawer in my lab and pull open a particular drawer in a bank of drawers, pull open and pull out one of 300 footprint casts, but I could have pulled multiple examples from the blues, in this case, outside of Walla Walla, Washington, exact same confirmation of the remarkable spread of the toes. That you could almost interchange those 2 casts, and Josh's was a bit more robust, slightly bigger. And this is interesting now, because, see, there have long been in the traditions from the Himalayas, from Nepal and Bhutan and Tibet, that there were multiple types.
Yes.
There was the Telme, the Yeti, anyway. And the biggest one was the Dzute. Now, the Dzute has been explained away by most as being the Asiatic brown bear. And it also, so that also conflates in with all this other bear lore. But one of the interesting things about Sasquatch, which we kind of opened as a preamble with the Chinese example, is that there are multiple Asiatic examples of Sasquatch-like footprints.
Yes.
And this one that Josh brought back was not from up in the high elevation of the valleys. It was down in the foothills. And its size and configuration, the complete lack of a non-divergent big toe, I had a big spread, but not an opposable big toe, like the McNeely, Cronin, and the Hutchinson examples show, and the Shipton, if you allow for the pathology of the second digit. I think what he found were the if you want to call it zute, if we can co-opt that term, still for a Sasquatch-like giant creature, larger dimensions, that has a footprint that is consistent in many ways with Sasquatch tracks. I'm quite confident in the credibility of it. One of the things that kind of sold me was there were 3 casts that were made in the gravel there. Yeah. One of them was little more than just the heel strike, but they cast it. And what was interesting is we were able to do 3D scans here at the Idaho Museum of Natural History in their virtualization laboratory. So we created 3D scans, and that heel is impressed more deeply than the full print, but it was from the opposite foot. Well, you know, your feet are mirror images of one another. They're bilaterally symmetrical, but mirror images, right and left. We took that heel and reversed it digitally, the scan, and superimposed it digitally over the footprint, and it matches perfectly. The asymmetries of the heel, the curvature of the heel, and the slight asymmetry in shape that were side specific were maintained, or were approximated perfectly when you flipped it over and superimposed it. Now, that's something. I mean, first of all, who would think of that? Yeah. I mean, I guess you could argue, well, someone had 2 artificial feet, and they were very careful in how they carved or prepared the feet so that they were mirror images, and you just simply got the heel imprint. So, yes. I mean, I just don't know that, because these were certainly not made by simply walking with stompers, you know, with carved wooden feet, say, or some modeled rigid prosthetic, plastic prosthetic or something, or rubber coated. Because I mean, the circumstances, I mean, were such that this footprint was impressed pretty deeply into that gravel bar.
Yes,
and gravel and sand, but it was quite coarse. In fact, the one heel, as it came out of the creek, it didn't leave a full footprint. It just left where the weight of the heel really struck on a softer spot. Anyway, so if they're credible, and I'm fairly comfortable that they are, and I know Josh, and I know, I mean, given the sequence of events that subsequently followed, and the ultimate fate of that footprint, and its the notoriety that it has received, I'm fairly confident that it's legitimate. If it's legitimate, it's not a typical Yeti, but it represents one more example that I have probably a dozen of Sasquatch-like footprints across Eastern Asia, Southern Asia, up skirting the Himalayas, all the way west to the Caucasus Mountains, where there are examples of footprints. And when I take these pictures of the Chinese, the Caucasus, the Nepalese, and if I mix them in with examples of Sasquatch footprints in a montage slide, you wouldn't be able to pick out which ones are different than the North American Sasquatch, which ones stand out as something different, inconsistent with the Sasquatch footprints. They're that remarkably consistent. So, yeah, it's interesting.
Oh, no, I mean, and also you have to question the risk of somebody like Josh being a willing participant in a hoax, because I mean, like you mentioned there, the thing about, was it Nepal?
I think it was Nepal, because I think it was right down in the foothills. They were still getting ready to go up into the higher. I mean, they weren't going clear up into the snowfields and the passes, but they glaciers, but they were going up higher to higher elevation.
Yeah.
They were still kind of, and so they were just out on a hike along a trail in those foothills, and that's when they heard the disturbance. Someone heard the breaking of brush and something plowing through the undergrowth, and they happened to shine their lights down there and find those imprints. I mean, you could say, wow, what a coincidence, but I mean, sometimes people are just in the right place at the right time. Who knows?
Absolutely. And like you say, usually if someone's trying to do something like that, they would probably do more.
Why?
They wouldn't just do two and a bit.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to second guess a would-be hoaxer, but like you started to point out, the potential fallback, the negatives of being accused of or having it revealed that you were involved and perpetrated a hoax. The blowback for his reputation and the success of his ongoing series of documentary shows, I think the potential negatives far outweigh any benefit that he's going to reap from this incident. So but that I always one can weigh all those things in the mix.
Yep.
But ultimately you got to come back and look at the footprints. And for me, when you see the side-by-side comparison of something that at first blush, with a lack of familiarity, looks odd. I mean, those toes, those almost spidery toes sticking out at odd angles, seems very... I mean, if you're going to hoax it, why would you pick the oddest looking example to emulate?
Yes.
Why would you do that? Why would you... you would think that that a hoaxer would try to use something that's the most mainstream appearing, most consistent with the other evidence, rather than an apparent outlier. And to someone unfamiliar, until I pull out that example and stick it side by side and see the remarkable similarity, you would think, why would you? Well, that looks weird. Why would you do that?
Who knows?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for
you're welcome.
A wonderful conversation. I didn't expect us to dive into the Yeren or the Yeti, but I'm delighted that we did.
Well, we've got a topic for a third meeting then, another 10 months.
I hope so. I'll hold you to that again, Jeff.
Yeah, certainly.
So, my friend, where can everybody follow you online, get any copies of your previous work? And I know, obviously, as I touched on in the introduction, there will be an eagerly awaited sequel to your wonderful Sasquatch Legend Meets Science book coming as well. So where can everybody keep up to date with what you've got going on, sir? Right.
Well, the Facebook page is kind of my bulletin board. And so I post when upcoming appearances, things that I come across that tickle my fancy or catch my interest. I like to share those with people and get conversation or hear their remarks. So Facebook page, which is in under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. Again, reiterate, send people to the Relic Hominid Inquiry. If you're not familiar with Sasquatch Legend Meets Science, the book, that's a primer. It's a must read for anyone embarking down this road to look at that. Another book project, I mean, since we got off onto the Relic Hominid in a broader context, I have a couple of field guides that are also kind of little primers. And one of those, the second one, is a guide to relic hominoids of the world. I think the title is Sasquatch, Yeti, and Other Relic Hominoids of the World. And you can find that on Amazon or on Paradise K. Parak.com is the publisher. And that is actually the shrunken head, the abstract of the book that I was working on before I got sidetracked onto Sasquatch Legend Meets Science 2. So once that's done, then I'll go back and what the ultimate book will be is sort of a reprise of Ivan Sanderson's book, but now 30 years later, and looking, because even then he had proposed not one but multiple lineages, multiple species of ABSMs, abominable snowmen.
Yes.
But in 1962, there was no accommodating such a suggestion. There couldn't be other bipedal hominids out there. And so it was just received as fiction, fantasy. Yeah. But it's interesting that now, and this is where, the science is catching up. Now we know the single species hypothesis is dead. Long live the bushy tree hypothesis, and many lineages have it persisted until very recently, perhaps even until the present. So it's going to be interesting to recast Sanderson's thesis in a modern context and be able to fold in all of my personal experiences, some of which we've shared here today. So
fabulous. I can't wait for that.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Me neither.
Well, as always, it's an absolute pleasure, and I thoroughly enjoy speaking with you and you taking the time to spend your busy schedule around with me. And I know you've got a really hectic summer coming up, and anybody who has yet to see you speak in person, I recommend you will find you at numerous conferences over the year. And I just wish you the very best for the rest of 2025, and we'll pencil that in for January 2026 then, Jeff, okay. And we'll do it. We'll see where we go next time.
All right. Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.